There are so many mysteries in the world, and even around us. Sometimes they're easy to solve. With modern technologies these days, in every crime's case, be it felony, kidnapping, or homicide, the forensic team can trace the perpetrator within days or even a few hours without any difficulty. But sometimes the police run into cases where all modern facilities cannot help them. It took years for them to get closure. So these are the top 5 unsolved cases that were solved years later. Number 5. Joseph James Dangelo is suspected of committing one of the most notorious unsolved crime sprees in California history, allegedly responsible for at least 12 homicides and at least 45 other cases throughout California in the 1970s and 80s. The former police officer was arrested on April 24, 2018, after California investigators matched crime scene DNA with genetic material stored by a distant relative on an online site. It was indeed the first public arrest obtained through genetic testing. To identify Dangelo, investigators narrowed the family tree search based on age, location, and other characteristics. Once authorities zeroed in on Dangelo, they surveyed him and collected his DNA from a tissue left in the trash. After Dangelo was taken into custody, he said to himself in an interview room, "I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives." Prosecutors used this statement in court during the guilty plea. Between 1973 and 1979, he was a police officer in the California towns of Exeter and Auburn. He was let go from the force after he was charged with stealing a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. Authorities have also indicated that they believe Dangelo is associated with nearly 100 burglaries in the city of Visalia in the mid-1970s attributed to the Visalia ransacker. Starting with the 1976 violation of a woman, he would go on to violate at least 13 more girls and women before moving on to attacking primarily couples. He would typically separate the man from the woman, binding the man and placing dishes on his back so that if he moved, he would hear them. He took the lives of Brian and Katie Maggiore in Rancho Cordova in 1978 and went on to execute 10 more people, ending in 1986. In August of 2020, Dangelo was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The death penalty was taken off the table for reasons unknown, but he will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Number 4. For nearly 40 years, police could not track down the Illinois horseman who took the lives of 3 young boys in a stable. On October 6, 1955, police believed Kenneth Hansen picked up Robert Peterson, John Schuessler, and Anton Schuessler Jr. on Milwaukee Avenue south of Lawrence Avenue when they were hitchhiking after a day of movies and bowling. He lived nearby at the time in the 5000 block of North Claremont Avenue. He took the boys to his stable and eventually took their lives, throwing their bodies in a forest-preserved ditch. In 1955, the discovery of these boys in a ditch had no precedent. There had been little warning that the world could be that way. Despite a massive police investigation that included questioning at least 43,740 people, including Hansen, no one was charged. Hansen went on with his life. He married and had 2 sons, whom he raised while operating a riding stable called Camelot near Tinley Park. Then, in 1994, during an investigation into the mysterious disappearance of Helen Brock, several people had apparently implicated Kenneth Hansen in the disappearance of the boys. Hansen was brought to trial after a renewed investigation of the case by the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, as well as the Chicago Police. He was identified as a suspect through evidence developed in arson investigations at area horse stables and the 1977 disappearance of Helen Brock. At the first trial, witnesses testified that Hansen told them he'd taken the lives of the boys in a tack room at the Idle Hour stable, then owned by the notorious horseman Silas Jane. Hansen, aged 74 at the time, was finally found guilty in 1995 of the boys' homicide, but then passed away of natural causes in the Pontiac Correctional Center. Karen Daniel, Hansen's lawyer in his latest appeal, said he told her he was innocent of the 3 homicides, and there was evidence that wasn't heard, that another man had confessed to the homicides. But a source familiar with the case said that Hansen was suffering from dementia when he passed away. Number 3. Police knew that John List took the life of his mother, wife, and 3 children. They just didn't know how to find him. In 1971, the accountant took all of his family members' lives, leaving their remains neatly laid in the ballroom of his mansion, arranging their photos and books he'd borrowed from a neighborhood on a table, and then disappearing. When police officers entered the home on December 7, 1971, they heard organ music on an intercom system and found the remains of Mr. List's wife, Helen, age 46, his daughter Patricia, his son John, and Frederick, and his mother Alma. They'd all been silenced by firearms. The police also found a note from Mr. List to his pastor at the Lutheran church where Mr. List sometimes taught Sunday school. In it, he explained that his financial struggles had become too difficult to handle, and he thought he was doing his victims a favor by taking their lives. He said, quote, "At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows if that would have been the case." Mr. List, age 46 at the time, had trouble holding a job and was strapped by a mortgage and apparently was taking money from his mother's account, investigators were told. From New York, he had traveled over to Denver, where he began a new life under the name Robert P. Clark, working as a hotel fry cook and later as an accountant for an H&R Block. He joined a local Lutheran church and in 1985 married a widow named Dolores Clark, with whom he moved to Richmond, Virginia. In 1989, America's Most Wanted featured List and a forensic sculptor's impression of how he would look then, 18 years after the homicides. List caught the tail end of the show with his wife, who did not know his past. His wife didn't seem to have recognized him from the programming. But back in Denver, his former neighbors did recognize him and called the police. He was arrested 11 days later, and after a jury rejected his diminished capacity defense, he was convicted and sentenced. In a 3-sentence statement to the court, he said he was sorry for the tragedy that happened in 1971. Mr. List was convicted of homicide and sentenced to 5 life terms in prison. He appealed unsuccessfully on the grounds that his judgment had been impaired by post-traumatic stress disorder from military service back in World War II and Korea. Number 2. In 1986, Cherie Rasmussen, a critical care nurse, was found passed away in the condo she shared with her husband of 3 months, John Rutan. In a few short minutes, though, her new charmed life ended in a homicide that would go unsolved for 20 years. Police assumed that 2 robbers had broken in and taken her life, and the case went cold, according to ABC. But 27 years later, they figured out the real story. With the help of advancing technology, the Los Angeles Police Department's cold case squad cracked the case. After running a DNA test on a bite mark on Rasmussen's body, they confronted a new and shocking likelihood. The perpetrator was one of their own, Officer Stephanie Lazarus. The crime was initially deemed to be a robbery gone awry, as Rasmussen's BMW was stolen. The initial suspects were 2 Latino men who were believed to have committed other burglaries in her neighborhood. Lazarus was also a suspect in the initial investigation but was cleared. Rasmussen's family still believed Lazarus was involved, as they had both dated Rutan, and Lazarus had once shown up at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where Rasmussen worked and had threatened her. In the meantime, Lazarus continued working with the Los Angeles Police Department. She went on to her own private investigative firm, Unique Investigations. 23 years after the homicide of Cherie Rasmussen, the case was still unsolved. In February of 2009, however, a cold case detective squad decided to reinvestigate the case. Investigators discovered female DNA from a bite mark on Rasmussen's body, and Stephanie Lazarus became the prime suspect. After the detectives were able to match Lazarus's DNA with the DNA found on Rasmussen's body, Lazarus was arrested for the homicide on June 5, 2009. She was then allowed to retire early from the LAPD. She was held in the Los Angeles County Jail with a $10 million bail. Stephanie Lazarus's trial began in early 2012. Prosecutors believed Lazarus's motive for the homicide was jealousy over Cherie Rasmussen's relationship with her boyfriend. On March 8, 2012, Lazarus was convicted of Rasmussen's crime in the first degree. She was later sentenced in May of 2012 to 27 years in prison, and she's currently serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. She'll be eligible for parole in 2039. Number 1. In May of 1990, a woman put on a clown suit, red nose, white makeup, and an orange wig, and drove to Marlene Warren's house and gunned her down. She then turned around, hopped in her car, and managed to evade capture for nearly 3 decades. When Warren answered the door, witnesses reportedly heard a gunshot before the suspect calmly walked back to the LeBaron and drove away. Warren passed away 2 days later. The clown fed in a white Chrysler LeBaron, which was found 4 days later abandoned at a shopping center parking lot. Her case ultimately went cold until 2014. That year, investigators learned one suspect, Sheila Keene Warren, had married Warren's widow, Michael, in 2002. At the time of Marlene's homicide, Sheila, then 27, reportedly worked for Michael Warren's used car dealership, Bargain Motors, in West Palm Beach, helping to repossess cars. Detectives discovered Michael Warren was rolling back odometers on vehicles at his used car lot. He was convicted of racketeering and multiple other felonies and served nearly 4 years in a minimum security prison at the Homestead Correctional Institute. He was released on New Year's Eve in 1997. 5 years later, he and Sheila Keene Warren were married in Los Angeles, a fact that investigators didn't know until they reopened the case in 2014. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office used a $125,000 federal grant and formed a task force with members of the state attorney's office and the FBI. They interviewed numerous witnesses, took a fresh look at evidence, and ordered the DNA testing to be done, leading to an August 31 grand jury indictment. The Warrens had no idea they were under scrutiny once again. They lived in small historic Abingdon, Virginia for 15 years until her arrest. They had a reputation as a hardworking, friendly couple. No one there knew about their past. Suddenly the day came that the U.S. Marshals pulled over their black Cadillac Escalade and took Keene Warren into custody. She's pleaded not guilty to first-degree homicide charges and is being held at Palm Beach County Jail without bond. Sheila Keene Warren was initially facing the death penalty. However, investigators announced they would not pursue it in February of 2020, according to court documents. Keene Warren was supposed to go to trial on May 29, 2020, but it was postponed due to the pandemic. A judge later set her new trial date for April of 2021. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.